There is a moment in every great geopolitical conflict when the fog of war begins to lift, not because the fighting has stopped, but because the underlying logic of the struggle becomes impossible to conceal any longer. We are living through precisely such a moment today, and what is being revealed, layer by layer, is a strategic reality so uncomfortable for Washington that most of its analysts and commentators are still struggling to articulate it in plain language. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile-wide choke point through which roughly one-fifth of the world's entire petroleum supply flows every single day, has become the most consequential body of water on the planet. And what is happening there right now, on this 14th day of May 2026, tells us more about the shifting balance of global power than almost anything else we could examine. Let us begin with the fact that broke quietly through the noise of diplomacy and military posturing earlier today. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps confirmed that dozens of vessels, including ships owned by Chinese interests, have been permitted to transit the Strait of Hormuz under what Tehran is now calling its management protocols. This was not an accident. It was not a miscommunication. It was a deliberate, calculated, and extraordinarily revealing diplomatic signal sent simultaneously to Beijing, to Washington, and to the rest of the watching world. Iran, a country that has been under relentless bombardment by the combined military forces of the United States and Israel since the 28th of February this year, is choosing who may pass through the world's most critical maritime choke point, and it is choosing China. The United States Navy, for all its carrier battle groups and its destroyers and its Boeing P-8 Poseidon patrol aircraft, cannot compel Iran to open that strait on American terms. That is the central strategic reality of this war, and it is one that Washington has not yet fully absorbed. To understand why this matters so profoundly, we need to step back from the immediate drama of ship movements and naval intercepts and think carefully about what the Strait of Hormuz actually represents in the architecture of global power. Before this conflict began, approximately 3,000 vessels passed through that strait every single month. The pre-war flow represented not merely oil, though the oil alone, comprising 20% of global petroleum supply, was staggering enough, but also liquefied natural gas, manufactured goods, and the entire economic metabolism of the Persian Gulf region. Countries across East and Southeast Asia, Japan, South Korea, India, and above all China, depend on that flow with an intimacy that no amount of strategic diversification has been able to fully replace. When Iran closed the strait in late February and early March, it did not merely disrupt shipping lanes, it reached directly into the economic bloodstream of Asia and squeezed. And now, having squeezed, it is selectively releasing pressure, but only for Beijing. What most analysts still fail to understand is what this selective opening actually represents in terms of Iran's strategic calculation, and what it tells us about the deeper architecture of the emerging multipolar world. Iran is not simply rewarding China for its diplomatic support, though that support has been real and consistent. Iran is doing something far more sophisticated. It is demonstrating to every nation on earth that the framework of American dominance, the system by which Washington's military presence in the Persian Gulf was supposed to guarantee the free flow of commerce and enforce a rules-based international order, has been fundamentally compromised. The United States spent decades building a military infrastructure in the Gulf precisely to prevent any regional power from being able to hold global shipping hostage. Aircraft carriers, naval bases in Bahrain and Qatar, prepositioned forces, intelligence networks, all of it was designed to make the scenario we are now witnessing impossible. And yet here we are. The historical parallel that comes to mind most forcefully is not, as many commentators reflexively suggest, the Suez Crisis of 1956, though that crisis does contain some instructive echoes. The more illuminating comparison is perhaps the slow erosion of British naval supremacy in the early 20th century, the long, painful process by which a power that had genuinely believed in its own permanent dominance of the world's sea lanes was forced to confront the emergence of competitors it could neither absorb nor suppress. Britain did not lose its naval supremacy in a single decisive battle. It lost it gradually through the accumulation of strategic overextension, fiscal strain, and the rise of powers whose industrial and demographic weight eventually overwhelmed the advantages of an established hegemon. The United States today is not Britain in 1905, but the structural parallels are worth dwelling on because history rarely announces its turning points with fanfare. It announces them through small, specific, concrete events, like a few dozen Chinese-owned ships sailing unmolested through a strait that American naval power is supposed to control. But this next development completely changes the strategic picture, and it is one that requires careful examination before we can fully grasp the implications of what is unfolding. While Iranian vessels were selectively permitting Chinese-flagged and Chinese-owned ships to transit Hormuz, Donald Trump was sitting in Beijing with Xi Jinping. The timing of this was not coincidental. China has been playing a role in this conflict that Western media has consistently underreported and mischaracterized. Beijing has not been a passive bystander to the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. It has been a careful, patient, and extraordinarily sophisticated actor, one that has watched Washington pour military resources, political capital, and economic ammunition into a conflict whose strategic logic was always questionable, while China has been quietly accumulating advantages across every dimension of the competition that actually matters for long-term global influence. A confidential United States intelligence analysis, details of which have emerged today, paints a picture that should alarm any serious student of geopolitics. According to two American officials familiar with the document, China has been systematically exploiting the Iran war to maximize its advantage over the United States across military, economic, diplomatic, and soft power fields simultaneously. This is not opportunism in the casual sense of the word. This is the execution of a long-prepared strategic playbook, one that Beijing has been refining for years in anticipation of precisely the kind of American strategic overextension that this war represents. While the United States has been spending billions of dollars per week sustaining a military campaign against Iran, while American carriers and destroyers have been tied down in the Persian Gulf, enforcing a blockade that has raised global oil prices by more than 40%, China has been deepening trade relationships, expanding its diplomatic footprint, and positioning itself as the indispensable partner for the very countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America that are suffering most from the disruption of global energy markets that American military action has caused. There is a profound irony embedded in this situation that deserves explicit recognition. The United States launched Operation Epic Fury, the code name for its joint military operations with Israel against Iran, which began on February 28th and reportedly concluded on May 5th, with a set of strategic objectives that included regime change in Tehran, the destruction of Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs, and the reassertion of American dominance in the Persian Gulf region. 3 months later, Iran's regime, though severely damaged, has not collapsed. Its nuclear facilities have been struck but not permanently eliminated, and the Strait of Hormuz, the control of which was supposed to demonstrate the irresistible force of American military power, remains under effective Iranian management, with Beijing as the designated beneficiary of whatever partial opening Tehran chooses to allow. It is difficult to imagine a more complete inversion of the intended strategic outcome. The human cost of this conflict is a dimension that analytical commentary too often sets aside in favor of the cleaner language of strategic competition. But the human cost is itself strategically relevant because it shapes the political environment in which decisions are made. Lebanon's health ministry has reported more than 2,800 people killed in Israeli strikes since the conflict escalated in early March, more than 8,000 wounded, and over 1 million displaced. Iran has suffered thousands of civilian casualties from American and Israeli strikes on military installations, government buildings, schools, hospitals, and heritage sites. The Iranian city of Tehran has been struck repeatedly. Infrastructure across the country has been systematically degraded. Roads, bridges, power generation facilities, water systems. A CNN journalist driving from northwestern Iran toward Tehran today reported that the journey was taking far longer than usual because so much of the country's infrastructure had been destroyed. This is not a surgical military campaign. It is a comprehensive assault on a nation's capacity to function, and its effects will reverberate for decades regardless of how the immediate conflict is eventually resolved. What makes this human dimension strategically significant is the political reaction it is generating, not only in the broader Muslim world and among developing nations, but within the United States itself. Republican resistance to the Iran war is now growing openly in the Senate. Senator Murkowski, previously a reliable supporter of executive military authority, has reversed her position. This is not a trivial development. It reflects a deeper unease within the American political establishment about a war whose costs, financial, human, reputational, and strategic, are becoming impossible to justify against the backdrop of outcomes that fall consistently short of the objectives that were used to sell the campaign to the American public in the first place. The Producer Price Index in the United States rose 6% for the 12 months ending in April, the highest level since December 2022, with energy costs driven by the Iran war identified as the primary driver. American consumers are paying more for fuel, more for goods, more for everything that moves through supply chains touched by elevated energy costs. And the political patience for this sacrifice is visibly eroding. And if you think this was the peak of the crisis, the real implications only begin to emerge when we examine what Iran is now demanding as the price of peace, and why Washington's response to those demands reveals so much about the fundamental strategic miscalculation at the heart of this entire enterprise. Iran has set 5 preconditions for resuming direct peace negotiations with the United States. These include the lifting of sanctions and compensation for war-related damages. Tehran has explicitly rejected the most recent American 14-point peace proposal, characterizing it as a demand for surrender, an attempt, in the words of Iranian officials cited by the semi-official Fars news agency, to secure through diplomacy what Washington had failed to achieve on the battlefield. This is the language of a country that does not believe it has been defeated. And in the most important strategic sense, the sense that concerns the long-term distribution of power and influence in the region and the world, Iran may be correct in that assessment. The question of who is actually winning this war cannot be answered by counting destroyed military installations or measuring the reduction in Iran's conventional military capacity. Those metrics, while not irrelevant, capture only the surface of a conflict whose deeper strategic significance lies elsewhere entirely. To answer the question of victory and defeat in any meaningful sense, we must ask a different set of questions. Which actors have seen their long-term strategic position strengthened by this conflict? Which have seen it weakened? Which relationships between states, between economies, between civilizations have been fundamentally altered, and in whose favor? When we ask the question this way, the answer that emerges is deeply uncomfortable for Washington, and it points toward a conclusion that the American foreign policy establishment has not yet been willing to state openly. China is winning this war, not on any battlefield, not through any military action of its own. China is winning it in the way that matters most over any extended time horizon, through the patient accumulation of strategic advantage, while its primary geopolitical competitor exhausts itself in a military campaign whose costs are real and mounting, and whose benefits have proven far more elusive than advertised. The selective opening of the Strait of Hormuz to Chinese-owned vessels is not merely a tactical concession by Iran to a friendly power. It is a public demonstration, visible to every government and every shipping company and every energy market in the world, that China has secured a position of privilege in the management of the world's most critical maritime choke point, a position that the United States, for all its military presence in the region, has been unable to secure for itself. This is the kind of reputational and structural advantage that reshapes the calculations of dozens of smaller powers who are watching carefully and drawing their own conclusions about where the future of global order lies. Pakistan's role in this conflict deserves more careful examination than it has received in most Western commentary, because it illuminates with particular clarity the complexity of the alignments that are emerging in this new strategic environment. Pakistan mediated between the United States and Iran in the Islamabad talks, a role that positioned Islamabad as a valuable diplomatic interlocutor and enhanced its standing with both Washington and Tehran simultaneously. But it has also emerged through subsequent reporting that Pakistan covertly permitted Iranian military aircraft to use Pakistani airfields, including Nur Khan Air Base near Islamabad, potentially shielding those aircraft from American strikes. This is not the behavior of a country that has made a clean strategic choice between the American and Iranian camps. It is the behavior of a country that is navigating a multipolar world with considerable sophistication, extracting benefits from its relationships with multiple competing powers while avoiding the kind of definitive commitment that would foreclose its options. Pakistan is not unique in this approach. It is representative of a broad category of middle powers in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East itself, that are watching the United States struggle in this conflict and recalibrating their own strategic orientations accordingly. The ceasefire that was announced on April 7th and 8th, agreed to by the United States and Iran after more than 5 weeks of intense fighting, was presented by the American administration as a diplomatic achievement, and in the narrow sense that it temporarily halted the most intense phase of military exchange, it was. But a ceasefire that Iran did not honor in its most critical provision, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, is not really a ceasefire in any strategically meaningful sense. It is a pause. And the terms under which that pause has been extended reveal the extent to which American leverage over Iran has been more limited than Washington anticipated. When Trump announced he was postponing strikes against Iranian power plants, citing ongoing negotiations, Iran denied that any such negotiations were taking place and called the president deceitful. When the United States presented its 14-point peace plan, Iran rejected it as a surrender document. When the ceasefire's 2-week term expired, the fighting did not immediately resume, but neither did the strait reopen on American terms. Instead, Iran began selectively applying its own management protocols, permitting Chinese ships to pass while American naval forces watched from a distance. However, this is where the situation becomes far more dangerous because the structural pressures that are building on both sides of this conflict are pushing toward escalation rather than resolution. The economic costs of the Hormuz closure are becoming catastrophic for Iran's neighbors and for the global economy simultaneously. Commercial traffic through the strait stands at approximately 5% of its pre-war level. Oil prices have risen more than 40% since the conflict began. Fuel shortages and rationing are affecting parts of Asia. The International Monetary Fund has warned that global growth will suffer even if the ceasefire holds. And yet, despite these mounting costs, neither side has been able to translate military pressure into the political outcome it seeks. The United States cannot force Iran to reopen the strait on terms that Washington finds acceptable, because doing so would require either a ground invasion, an option that is politically and militarily inconceivable, or an escalation of aerial bombardment to a level that would produce casualties and destruction so catastrophic as to be politically unsustainable in the United States itself. Iran, for its part, cannot end the blockade of its ports without either capitulating to American demands, which its leadership has explicitly characterized as a surrender, or finding a diplomatic formula that allows it to claim a measure of face-saving victory. The role of Russia in this conflict is another dimension that Western commentary has consistently underweighted. Russia has benefited materially from the elevation of global oil prices, a direct consequence of the disruption of Persian Gulf energy flows. Together with China, Moscow vetoed a United Nations Security Council resolution on the Strait of Hormuz in early April that would have called for an end to Iranian attacks on shipping and created a framework for international escort of commercial vessels. This veto was not merely a reflexive defense of a diplomatic partner, it was a deliberate choice to perpetuate the conditions that are raising oil revenue for Russia while simultaneously draining American military and financial resources in a conflict that serves no Russian interest to see resolved quickly on American terms. The alignment of interests between Moscow and Beijing in this situation is not a formal alliance. It does not require coordination meetings or signed agreements. It is a convergence of strategic self-interest that produces parallel behavior without explicit coordination, and it is all the more powerful for its informal character. What most analysts still fail to understand is what comes next, and why the trajectory of this conflict matters not merely for the Middle East, but for the entire architecture of international order that has structured global politics since the end of the Second World War. The United States built its post-war global position on several interlocking pillars: military supremacy, economic dominance, the attraction of its political model, and the credibility of its security guarantees to allies. Each of these pillars has been under stress for years, but the Iran war has accelerated the erosion of all of them simultaneously. American military supremacy has failed to produce the political outcomes it was deployed to achieve. The economic costs of the conflict, rising inflation, disrupted supply chains, elevated energy prices, are visibly damaging the domestic political consensus that sustains American foreign policy activism. The moral authority of the United States, already severely damaged by decades of military interventions across the Muslim world, has suffered further in the eyes of the global majority from the scale of civilian casualties in Iran and Lebanon. And the reliability of American security guarantees is being quietly questioned by allies in Asia and Europe, who are watching Washington struggle with a regional power that, by any conventional metric, should have been manageable. The Iran war has also done something that no amount of Chinese diplomatic maneuvering or Russian strategic patience could have achieved on its own. It has demonstrated, in the most concrete and visible terms possible, that the era of unchallenged American unipolarity is over. This does not mean that the United States is weak. American military capacity remains formidable by any absolute standard. But power in international relations is always relative, always contextual, and always contingent on the willingness of other actors to accept the legitimacy of its exercise. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz today, Chinese ships passing freely while American naval forces maintain a blockade that Iran is selectively circumventing, is a live demonstration, broadcast to every government and strategist on the planet, that American power has limits that were not supposed to be visible. That visibility itself is strategically significant in a way that transcends the immediate tactical situation. Iran's decision to launch large-scale military exercises around Tehran, a 5-day exercise that the IRGC has named Martyr Commander, in the midst of these fragile ceasefire negotiations, is itself a communication. It is Iran telling Washington and telling the world that it has not been broken. That its military capacity, though damaged, retains coherence and operational capability. That any American calculation about the costs of resuming intensive military operations must account for a force that is preparing itself for precisely that contingency. The exercises are not merely military preparation. They are political theater, sophisticated, deliberate, and addressed to multiple audiences simultaneously. To the Iranian domestic public, they are a demonstration of resilience and national defiance. To Washington, they are a reminder that the costs of escalation remain high. To Beijing and Moscow, they are a signal that Iran intends to remain a significant actor in the regional and global balance, regardless of the damage it has absorbed. And to the broader community of nations watching from a distance, they are evidence that the United States has not achieved the decisive victory that was implicitly promised when Operation Epic Fury was launched. But what happened next in the diplomatic sphere was in some ways even more significant than the military exercises. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a covert visit to the United Arab Emirates and met with UAE President Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, a visit that Netanyahu's office subsequently described as resulting in a historic breakthrough in Israeli-Emirati relations. The significance of this visit lies not in whatever diplomatic arrangements were reached, the details of which remain undisclosed, but in what it reveals about the fracturing of regional alignments that this war has produced. The UAE, a country that signed the Abraham Accords with Israel in 2020 and has maintained generally cooperative relations with Washington, nonetheless struck Iranian oil infrastructure covertly during the conflict, an action that was revealed only subsequently and that was not authorized by or coordinated with the United States. The Gulf Arab states are not behaving as reliable American proxies in this conflict. They are pursuing their own interests, making their own calculations, and operating with a degree of strategic autonomy that reflects the more genuinely multipolar environment that this conflict has accelerated. The growing Republican resistance to the Iran war in the United States Senate is a development whose significance extends well beyond American domestic politics. Senator Murkowski's decision to reverse her position and join the critics of the war is a leading indicator of a broader shift in the political environment that ultimately constrains what any American administration can do. Wars that lack durable domestic political support cannot be sustained indefinitely, regardless of the military capacity of the country waging them. The Vietnam War taught this lesson. The Iraq War reinforced it. The Afghanistan War confirmed it with particular finality, and now, 75 days into a conflict that was supposed to achieve regime change in Iran and restore American dominance of the Persian Gulf, the domestic political consensus that would be necessary to sustain an intensified campaign is visibly eroding. This matters for the trajectory of the conflict because it means that the United States is operating under time pressure that Iran, for all the suffering it has endured, is not experiencing in the same way. Authoritarian systems have a capacity to absorb political pain that democratic systems, constrained by electoral cycles and public opinion, do not. And if you think this analysis leads to a pessimistic conclusion about the prospects for a negotiated resolution, the reality is simultaneously more complicated and more instructive. The path to a settlement exists. It has always existed, but it requires Washington to accept an outcome that looks nothing like the objectives with which it launched this war. Iran will not dismantle its nuclear program under military duress. It will not accept permanent American military supremacy in its immediate neighborhood. It will not provide the public admission of defeat that some voices in Washington have been demanding. What Iran might accept, and what a serious diplomatic process might eventually produce, is a framework that addresses American and Israeli security concerns about Iranian nuclear capacity through verifiable agreements rather than military destruction, that restores Iranian access to international markets through sanctions relief, and that establishes new regional security arrangements that reduce the risk of future confrontation. This is essentially what the original JCPOA attempted to achieve before it was abandoned by the Trump administration in 2018. The wheel of history turns slowly, and its turns are often painful, but there is a certain dark irony in the possibility that the outcome of this devastating war may eventually look very similar to the diplomatic framework that patient negotiation had already constructed, and that was discarded in a moment of strategic hubris that now, in retrospect, appears almost incomprehensibly short-sighted. The Strait of Hormuz will eventually reopen fully. Global commerce will eventually resume its normal flow through those 21 miles of water. The immediate crisis will pass, but the strategic landscape that emerges from this conflict will be fundamentally different from the one that existed before February 28, 2026. China will have demonstrated its ability to secure privileged access to critical global infrastructure, even in conditions of active American military presence and declared hostility. Russia will have confirmed the value of its policy of strategic patience and selective obstruction. Iran will have established that it can absorb a major American military assault and survive with its political system intact, a precedent that no other country in the world will fail to notice and incorporate into its own strategic calculations. And the United States will have learned, at enormous cost in treasure and credibility and international standing, that military force alone cannot substitute for the patient construction of legitimate international frameworks that address the genuine security interests of all parties, including those that Washington finds most difficult to engage. That lesson was available without this war. The tragedy is that it required this war to make it unavoidable.